Well, hi guys. This is Tanner Pickett with Montreat Conference Center, and welcome to our first knowledge drop of 2018. I want to just talk briefly about what this is, do a little housekeeping thing, and then I'm going to introduce or let Michael introduce himself. Probably doesn't need much introduction, but I'm going to let him talk about himself and PYWA. As much as he wants, then we'll roll into this. So just briefly, this is our second series of knowledge drops. Last year, after talking to several people, we decided it was worthwhile to try to create a platform in which people who have expertise in youth ministry specifically could share their knowledge, right? And so people who are interested in that could have a really accessible way to come together and learn things and ask questions and share ideas. And we did that last year, I think 3 different times. It was pretty successful, but it was also kind of haphazardly put together. So we decided to give it another try this year.
Maybe because of the Deacon's thing, but she didn't tell me.
I'm not sure who's got sirens in the background. I think
that's me. Sorry.
All right, I'm muting you for a second. Anyway, so this year we're rolling out.
I think ask if she wanted to leave a message.
Okay. Anyway, so we're rolling these out again. This is the first one, and welcome. We've had a couple more people join us, so I'm just going to start off by saying a couple of quick things. I'm going to do a quick introduction here of the Zoom platform in case you're not familiar with that, tell you a little bit about some things to note, just some housekeeping things. Then I'm going to turn this over to Michael to introduce himself and talk a little bit about PIWA, and then to dive right into the program. So this should last about an hour or so. But feel free to come and go. So a couple of things about Zoom. If you haven't used it before, I can see several people's names, which means they're dialing in on their computer, which is fantastic. And you should be able to see a screen. There are some people that have joined by phone. We are recording this right now, and I tell you that for 2 reasons. One, if you're picking your nose on the screen, everybody's going to see that when they watch it later. And 2, most importantly, if you're dialing in by phone or for whatever reason you can't see this, or you want to go back to see what's covered later, because there was a really good point, you've got that, and we're just going to leave that up in perpetuity out on our website, and we'll email this out later so you guys have it, or the link that it's at. A couple of quick things. Most of us are muted right now, and we've done that intentionally as you came on board, just to kind of just to try to cut back on feedback. But I'm going to let Michael kind of lead the way as far as if he wants you to interrupt with questions or wants you to wait till the end. But if you are on particularly if you're on the computer, if you hover over your picture, there should be a little blue button that pops up that says unmute. And so if you would just try to mute yourself when you're not talking, and certainly remember to mute yourself when you're not talking, and remember to unmute when you're asking questions. The second thing, if you're on the computer, there's a cool chat feature, which is also helpful for questions. So if you want to just chat them as you go, that's helpful. And Michael, I think, will be watching that a little bit too, and I'll try to be watching on this end. And other than that, I think it's pretty straightforward. Again, if you have the privilege of looking on a screen, Michael, I think, is going to share a little bit of a PowerPoint later. So if you're not seeing that, you might want to log on later on your computer and check that out. So I guess without further ado, I'm going to mute myself and trade places with the one and only Michael Harper and let him take it from here. Again, just so we appreciate you guys participating in this and spread the word. We hope this is really useful, and we want to just continue to get the word out about this program.
Thank you to Tanner for getting all this started. I'm checking all the Zoom features to make sure we're good to go. Everybody can hear me okay? We're good? It's an absolute pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite topics. A little bit about me. I currently serve as the executive director of the Presbyterian Youth Workers Association, and I've been doing that for about a year. And we'll talk a little more about that in a second, maybe. But more importantly, I come from a career in youth ministry where I worked in the local church. For a long time, I served in the denominational offices as the editor and developer for the youth and young adult resources. So I got to get a different perspective on the church and on education and on curriculum. And that was a very helpful opportunity. And knowing that God calls us into places, I also believe that God calls us out of places. And that has led me towards a path that I never would have expected, which was to move more into a consultant phase and to be able to connect with different organizations in different way. So I have a facilitation business that I own. And as a part of that, I actually partner with an innovation organization out of Cincinnati. And I've learned a lot about what it means to have, to embrace disruption and to be able to understand what it means to move forward with what needs to happen in the church. And it's been a fascinating combination of my church world and the business world coming together. So that's what we're going to talk about today. In terms of Presbyterian Youth Workers Association, that's another fun opportunity for the business world and church world to come together. We are a 501c3 now, and we are an organization that exists to connect, uphold, and inspire Presbyterian youth workers to serve the triune God faithfully among young people. And when we say youth workers, that doesn't just mean paid people. That means volunteers as well. So what we do as an organization is find ways to pull people together and to help them be better as they faithfully serve the kids that are around them. So I'm glad to be a part of this knowledge drop, just to be able to even further the mission of PYWA and connect with Montreat as we explore these important topics together. So I'm going to jump into a PowerPoint, and I'm going to share my screen. And I usually do this correctly. I might need you to tell me if I've messed it up. So does everybody see a full screen of it says Embracing Disruption in Youth Ministry? Fantastic. So our starting place for me really is a disclaimer, and the disclaimer is this, that there's a good chance in this conversation today that I'm going to say something that's going to bug you. And I've worked hard to figure out what language that is. I try not to say there's a good chance that I'll upset you. I don't want to say things like I'll get under your skin. But this is a topic that challenges us to think in ways that may not be comfortable, because it's not how we always do things. This is about looking forward and looking at the disrupted church and then figuring out how we're going to move forward. And as I've experienced these opportunities to talk about this subject, there's often someone who gives me a dirty look at first, that I'm saying something that they don't want to hear. So I've learned just to kind of give a heads up that there's a good chance that what I'm saying may do something that might make you uncomfortable. The second piece of that is that the I'm trying to hit the right button to make it advance, is that I'm not providing lots of solutions today. I just want to put that out there to begin with, because sometimes we come to these opportunities to be together and we're looking for all these solutions, and you want to walk away with some kind of magic plan or a magic wand to take care of things. And that's not something we can get to in the time frame we have today. I will, however, make sure that I leave you with some stuff you can do to embrace the disruption and move forward. So I will make sure we have that. Here's kind of the overview of what we'll be talking about. From buying shoes to calling a taxi, we live, work, and worship in a disrupted world. And my whole point in this is, while some institutions have adapted to keep up with this changing world, youth ministry and the mainline church, and really the entire church, has remained the same. And so what I'm trying to challenge us to do is to embrace that disruption, to think differently about what we do and how we do it so that we can be faithful to who God is calling us to be. We're going to focus specifically on developing an understanding of disruption in the world. I'm going to give us an opportunity to track disruption in the church. We're going to look at some focus on creative ideation and problem solving, and then we want to claim what our current world is to see what's next. So before we jump into the disruption, would love to just, if you had to think about, and we don't have the ability to get people to answer this necessarily in this space, but what do you do? If you had to answer that question of what do you do, how would you respond to that? In my experience, what typically happens is that we say things like, well, I work with young people, or I serve as a youth minister at a church. But instead of looking at what it means just to be a youth worker, what if we have some kind of response like, well, I work for a global enterprise and I work with people in a context that we take care of them from birth to their deaths. We organize groups of people, all parts of the world. We are folks who work in hospitals and hospices. We work in education. We do stuff with social justice. And I love the chats that are popping up in terms of risk management and herding cats. Those are all the things that we do. So instead of just thinking, okay, I'm a youth worker, I work at a church, I'm in charge of programming, or in the case of folks who are on here, I organize Presbyterian stuff, I do programming, I go to meetings. What if we blow that up? What if we use that as a starting place to say, you know what? I'm not just a youth worker. I'm not just a Presbyterian exec. I am someone who changes lives. I'm someone who makes a difference each and every day. I'm someone who helps people understand that God loves them. I'm somebody who is ready to walk alongside young people who are having struggles to help them understand that God loves them and that there is hope in the world when we connect as followers of Jesus Christ. And on the one hand, that's perfectly obvious, right? We know that that's what we do. On the other hand, I think we're quick to sell ourselves short. So as part of embracing this disruption, I want to challenge us to blow all of this up, to think bigger, to think differently about everything that we do. And that's something that that we don't often have time for as youth workers, right? We're so stuck in our day-to-day tasks. We've got another meeting, we've got another newsletter article, we've got another program to get done, that we don't have the ability to really focus in on what it means to look forward and to think differently about youth ministry. So in terms of disruption, the best way I know to look at the concept of disruption is to forget about the church completely right now. And so I'm going to challenge us together to embrace the music industry as an industry that we can trace and think about what it means to enter disruption. And as we do that, if you could get a piece of paper or whatever you're working on, and you want to divide it into 4 quadrants, so you have places to take notes and 4 areas of that piece of paper. And in those quadrants, here are the questions we want to tackle. Who, what, disrupted who and what? In another quadrant, what role did technology play in the story? In another quadrant, who or what caused that pain? And then who or what caused the pain? So who disrupted who, or what disrupted what? Where does technology play into the conversation? Who caused pain in this story of disruption? And who felt the pain in the disruption? So I'm going to go through a timeline that's a very high level timeline to help you see how this disruption has worked over the past century plus. And as I do that, do your best to jot down some responses to those 4 questions on your paper. All right? I'm going to start in the 1800s. And of course, with music industry, we could go back centuries, right? We can trace the beginning of orchestras. We could trace the beginning of operas and how that moved around, especially Europe. We could look at African countries and how they used different kinds of music to be able to both communicate and connect culturally. But for our purposes, let's just stick with the past 100 years or so. So in the 1800s, you would go to the concert hall, right? If you wanted to hear music, if you wanted to hear the latest and greatest music, you would go to the concert hall. And in that concert hall, you would be exposed to whatever music was happening of the day. So the people who controlled that music were the people who led the bands, led the orchestras, and they decided what that band was going to play. So they decided what you were going to hear. Now, in addition to that, you would also be able to go to around the neighborhood, and people would be playing their own instruments around the neighborhood. That would be on front porches, back porches, church get-togethers. Those were times where people would be just hanging out, playing music, and sharing what that music would be. So you had control over what was being played there, and it may or may not have been what was being played at the concert halls. Now, if you think about the exchange of music and this exchange of ideas, it would have moved along those river routes, right? It would have been on places where you could get to by horseback, by carriages. When the whole locomotive came to being and we had the railroads across the United States, those things would have affected the transmission of music. But you were still being, held back by locality of what was being played in your certain area. You may not have the opportunity to hear what was being played across the ocean somewhere, right? So keep thinking about it. Where is there pain? Who's causing the pain? Who's feeling the pain? Where technology comes in? Think about those questions. Who's disrupting what? For instance, in the 1877, that's when the phonograph came to being, and the year later, that was the gramophone. So all of a sudden, we had this switch in control of music, and the recording industry now started. So it wasn't just the band leaders and the civic people who decided what was going to be played, or even music in the church, and the pastor, the church musician decided who could be played. We all of a sudden had access to other recordings. So we could create a recording, and then we could exchange that recording, and we could sell that recording, and all of a sudden the music that we were playing on our back porch, we might start to get some money for. As a musician, you wanted to get paid, you could record something and sell it, just like you could in terms of playing in a concert hall somewhere, so that even shifted. So with the recording of some kind of cylinder or disc that allowed some kind of recording, the nickel jukebox became really important in the 1890s. And all of a sudden you could go to this thing that was in whatever business that you went to, and you could choose what music you wanted to hear. Now for us, that sounds like nothing. But can you imagine the technology of being some kid who could go and push a button and instantaneously hear not just one person play, but a whole band play? Think of how transformative that would have been to somebody at the time. It transformed again in 1906. That's when they got rid of the cylinders that they were using for recording, and Victrola took over, and they started using the flat records. And in that, they started spinning at different speeds. And so they had to figure out who was going to make what kind of record player and what kind of record that would spin at which speed. With that kind of recording, that gave way to the 1920s when radio broadcasts first started happening. So think about it, instead of even having to have a record player where you changed out the records with your neighbors, you could just listen into the radio and hear an entire band playing. And that's when you had the rise of swing music, and people could listen in their homes for what that would be. Imagine how big of an effect this had on the music industry. We keep going. 1927, that's when the first movie with sound started. That was The Jazz Singer. And can you imagine, first of all, just going to the movie theater and seeing moving pictures? That was a big deal. But going and actually seeing some kind of sound with it would have been mind-blowing at the time. We can trace the whole film industry too. So that's a whole different way to track. We could do that separately later. But imagine the disruption in that industry as well with movies with sound. So then we get into FM radio. In the 1948, we had the Battle of the Speeds, where the different record companies were trying to figure out which speed would be best for people to use. Think of the 1950s, post-World War II, where we had all these kids being born and all the music that was taking off, that instead of having to go up and down the river, all of a sudden it was being broadcast nationally, internationally. All of a sudden people wanted to know more about it. Fast forward to 1964, we've got the cassette tape. I mean, that's a big deal. All of a sudden you had the ability to have this little cassette you put into a machine, and it played differently than the record player did. 1966, 8-track comes out. It tries to disrupt the cassette. That didn't really work out, but it was a different recording platform. 1970s, big scandal, because you could record using your cassette. So all of a sudden now you could get a blank cassette. Someone else could have a record. You could record that record, and then you could give away people's music without paying for it. That's a huge deal to the people that paid to record it, right? So in 1980s, that's when the compact disc came out. Then we get into writable CDs. That changed a lot when we moved from just regular compact disc to writable CDs and rewritable CDs. And that was the birth of the MP3, which leads to Napster. And Napster transforms everything. All of a sudden, we had the ability to freely exchange not just music up and down the river, not just music back and forth between houses, but now we have Napster where we're doing it electronically and we're doing it for free. So again, who's disrupting who? Where is that pain? Who caused the pain? Who's receiving the pain? Then we get into a bigger deal. iTunes launches in 2003. All of a sudden you can buy single songs. iTunes was catching up with Napster, and the recording industry didn't like that at all because they were selling away their songs for nothing, and they lost the money with that. 2007, the iPhone comes along. That affects the music industry because all the streaming services, the hotspots, we had 4G, so all of a sudden you could go to YouTube and you could type in the name of any song you wanted. You could be in the middle of wherever as long as you had cell service, and all of a sudden you could just pick whatever song you wanted and you could listen to it. No more are we in a situation where we actually have to buy something to be able to make it work. I remember being a youth worker back in the 90s, and there was an energizer that we learned at some conference, and I was trying to track down the people who recorded that song. It ended up that I had to contact a friend in Canada because it was a Canadian band. They had to go buy the CD for me and mail it where I was at the time, just so I could have this one energizer that I could do with the kids because they wanted to do it from a conference. Now all we have to do is go on YouTube, and not only is the music there, there's people there showing you how to do it, and you can do that within seconds and have it all ready to go. 2018, I don't know if you heard about it, but 5G is kind of the big topic for this year. That's a big deal because all of a sudden 5G is going to let us do things that 4G didn't let us do. There's still a lot of speculation out there of how quickly it'll come and where it'll come and what it'll do. But I got to go to the Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas a couple of months ago, and it was 5G was one of the big topics of how that's going to disrupt, especially the healthcare industry, because they can do more on 5G with people in their cell phones, with their smartphones, with home healthcare, because they can send different stuff to the hospitals transmitting through the 5G than they could with 4G. Not sure how it's going to affect youth ministry, but it will at some level, right? Probably our trips in terms of kids watching movies the whole time on the bus or whatever. Now think about it. On this timeline, we didn't really talk about recording artists. So for instance, recording artists who used to make a lot of money just on selling their music, they don't have that music to sell anymore. And the recording artists who used to sell merchandise at concerts, they still do, but they make different money off of it because now you can go onto Amazon and buy any concert t-shirt you want. You can go onto eBay and probably buy any concert t-shirt way back into the 70s, right? So if you're a recording artist, you're putting your music out there, you're getting paid less for it. So what do you do to make money? The current trend is to do meet and greets. So you can buy a VIP ticket to a concert, and each concert artist before a concert will have to sit and interact with fans who paid like $1,000 to be there. That's how they're making up the money. So in terms of our debrief, who and what disrupted who and what? How did technology play into that? And where is their pain? Who caused it and who felt it? I don't know if we have the ability to go through all of our answers, but I hope you were taking good notes. You could see how those different industries within the recording industry were disrupting each other. The cassette disrupted the record. And when you disrupt the record, you're not just disrupting one way to record, you're disrupting the studios who created the equipment to do the recording, all the marketing people who designed the record labels and the album covers, the people who make the record players. Think of all that disruption. And as you're thinking about it, who lost their jobs? Who were in charge of making something and that plant had to shut down? There's a lot of pain in that disruption that we just kind of gloss over and we don't think about. So the big question as you're looking for all those debrief questions in terms of where the pain is and disruption is and how technology played into it, the real question for me is how did the industry adapt to stay profitable? And I know as church people, we don't love the word profitable. We don't want to think of ourselves as a business. The challenge there, though, is we need to think more like a business if we want to be around in 20 years. For instance, if a company isn't making money, what happens? People stop getting paid, they lose their jobs, the company no longer exists. In the church, if we stop making money, what do? We push it as far as we can go to keep that church door open. We do everything we can to spend more money. We do everything we can to keep ourselves alive instead of making big, bold decisions about changing things. One of my favorite articles that I read recently was about Macy's. And if you think about Macy's, Macy's has a lot in common with the church. Macy's, many of their big flagship retail centers are where? They're downtown. And they're downtown in big buildings, and they're 5 and 6 stories tall. So they've got these downtown venues, and people aren't shopping anymore. They're not shopping anymore because they're shopping online. There's even the issue of going and trying things on at the store and then buying it at home online so you get a cheaper deal. So what is Macy's to do? Macy's got, these huge properties that are 6 stories tall. People aren't shopping downtown anymore. It's a huge liability. So Macy's is having to rethink what it means to be a downtown store. They're not closing up shop yet. I mean, they're having to close lots of stores around the country. But Macy's is having to figure out, well, what if we turn our 6th floor into an innovation hub? What if we turn the 2nd floor into a restaurant or a coffee shop? What if we make ourselves some kind of destination so that people will be able to help us as we figure out how to make the transition in this disrupted economy? So I do all of that, and I wanted to take you through in that much detail because I think it's a good practice. And if you ever have some time or you have the ability to meet with whatever committee in your congregation, trace a disrupted industry. And with that, you can pretty much pick any industry and trace that whole line. Pick a starting place, figure out where the disruption is, where the technology comes in, where there's pain in that whole story. Think about public transportation being disrupted by Uber. Think about Amazon disrupting groups like Walmart. And Walmart disrupted the mom and pop shop. So it's just an ongoing disruptive cycle. But let's switch to the church, right? So if we truly were to embrace disruption in the church, we have to trace it. And pick a starting place, go back, whenever you need to go back to, maybe beginning of the 20th century. And look at what the church has gone through throughout that time. Early 20th century, lots of small churches because you couldn't travel very far to get to a church. All of a sudden, the disruption of the automobile comes along and people can drive to go to a church. Churches get bigger. Then we get into the baby boom, and all of a sudden we had all these families with the people coming back from war, starting families, buying a home, moving to the suburbs. All of a sudden, the church becomes the central location for the social life and the faith life and everything that happens in the community. Then you trace the disruption of the 60s from the civil rights movement to the whole rock and roll hippie movement. All those things affect the church. 70s, we see the less people being connected to the church. The 80s were more of a social time in the church, perhaps. But trace that whole experience till we get to where we are now. And then the bigger question for me is, how have we as a church adapted to the disruption? These other industries, they've managed to adapt, or they go out of business. The church, what we're doing is still trying to use the same models we used 20, 30, 40 years ago. And instead of adapting and changing, what we're doing is just doing the same old. And then we look at this shrinking church. So what if we reframed that to think, instead of we are in this shrinking church, my job is in jeopardy, no one comes to church, the kids are too busy, no one wants to do this anymore, I don't know what to do. What if instead of that approach, what if we used it as an opportunity? What if we thought about what a great chance it is for us to be able to look at less social Christianity and more of an authentic discipleship-based ministry? So to start, I use design thinking, and that's just a process for problem solving that involves a lot of focus on the people. So it's human-centered design, thinking about what the problems are and how the people would react to coming up with new ideas. And so we start with a focus question, and it's, what are you trying to accomplish in your ministry with youth? One of the most painful stories I have for you is that when I was working in the curriculum development office, I had somebody way up go to a conference about Sunday school curriculum. And this person didn't really know much about youth ministry. They really didn't know much about education. They were just kind of there because they were supposed to be representing us. And so they came back and looked at me and said, hey, I've heard this great quote. You're going to love it. And I said, well, what is the quote? And he said, I heard this great quote about youth ministry, and it goes like this: all youth ministry is a big playpen with pizza. And my first reaction was completely to be offended. I can't believe that here's this person who's supposed to be helping us with our curriculum with youth, and that's all he thinks about is how youth ministry is a big playpen with pizza. But then the more I thought about it, the more it occurred to me that, you know what? I think that might be right. How often are we making deals with kids just trying to get them in the door to whatever our program is so that we don't look like failures? What if we reframed that to think about what we're really trying to accomplish instead of just getting kids in the door? How many times have we put our hearts and souls into kids knowing that they go off to college and they don't even just avoid church after that. They don't really seem to have much spiritual life. Or they're willing to be a good social participant in church stuff, and then they become a junior and senior in high school, they get a driver's license, they get busy, and they're out of there. And so really, church is just a social experiment for them and their families. If that's the case, all we are is playpens with pizza. So to reframe that, we have to come up with some kind of focus question. And I did this process with a group at a conference a year ago, and this is the question we came up with. It's a really powerful example of what we could be doing if we really wanted to focus our ministry. The question is this: how might we create a more faithful Christian formation experience for youth so they'll have a mature, distinctively Christian faith that draws them into community and out into the world to share God's love, hope, and justice? How might we create a more faithful Christian formation experience for youth so they will have a mature, distinctively Christian faith that draws them into community and out into the world to share God's love, hope, and justice? How does that compare to what you are currently doing in your ministry? A good place to start is whatever mission statement you have for your congregation or for your youth program. And if you don't have one, you need to work on one. And I'm a big fan of mission statements that can be recited under pressure. I work with a lot of congregations, and they show us their mission statements or their youth program mission statements, and there's these long statements that encompasses everything, and you can see, you can figure out that there was some retreat they went on, and on that retreat they ended up with all this information, wanted to squeeze it into a mission statement. But it's not helpful. It's not going to get them to where they need to be because it's too much. For instance, the Presbyterian Youth Workers Association, we exist to connect, uphold, and inspire Presbyterian youth workers to serve faithfully to faithfully serve youth, to faithfully serve the triune God among young people. I had to work that all out. But it's connecting, upholding, and inspiring. And if you can't say your mission statement that quickly, then you need to rethink what that mission is so you can stay focused to it. Once you have a focus question like this one that's on the screen, then you need to develop some empathy. It's part of the design thinking process. And what you do is you go in and you look at creative ways to really understand what it means to be that young person in your context, to be that parent in your context, to be the volunteer who's charged with being a person who's going to nurture that young person's faith. So you go and you talk to the basketball coaches and the baseball coaches and the people that you feel like you're competing against. You go talk to their school teachers about the pressure that they're under, maybe guidance counselors about what it means to have to get into college or face what's next after high school. Talk to as many people as you can to learn as much as you can about kids' lives. And don't go for the obvious questions, but go for questions that may not seem obvious at first. Really dig into what it means to be that kid, that parent, that teacher, that volunteer in the year 2018. Once you have that empathy developed, then you can start coming up with creative solutions. And there's lots of ideation processes you can do to be able to engage what it means to find those creative solutions. Once you are able to really come up with rethinking things, and like back to what do, you've got to think differently. You can find those creative solutions based on everybody paying attention to the empathy of the people in the room. When you have those creative solutions, there's a good chance you got to let go of something to implement them. And as you do that, you're going to find that it's about the big, bold ideas. So maybe it's time to stop having Sunday school because you only have 1 or 2 kids coming. And if 1 or 2 kids are coming and they're really not getting at that core discipleship that you want them to have, then you've definitely missed the point. Maybe it's better to create an individual education plan for each of those 2 kids that you work with them and their parents to study the Bible and discipleship and really engage them in topics, theological topics that they get excited about. And maybe you keep up with them through texting as you work on that individual education plan. Maybe the idea of group ministry has expired for your context. Whatever it is, we can't keep doing what we're doing now. We've got to think differently, paying attention to disruption and understanding the people in the room. In terms of wrapping up, so we have some time for some questions. There's some big things happening in this process. And as I said earlier, we're just getting the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to it. We're not going to get to the actual solutions in our time together today. But you need to pay attention to a lack of loyalty to the institution. And if you're here as a volunteer or as a paid youth worker, you have a loyalty to the institution because that institution is either supporting you or giving you a paycheck. So how do you reconcile this institution that is employing you, knowing that the people that you serve have very little loyalty to it? There's another important piece of the innovation process that's fail fast, fail cheap, which is kind of the opposite of what we do as youth workers, right? So as we plan, instead of studying something for a year and then spending another year planning it, organizing it, getting a committee, and then we launch it and then no one wants to come, fail fast, fail cheap. If you have an idea, put it into action immediately, but don't invest a lot of money in it. And more importantly for us, don't invest a lot of our time in it, because time is money. How often do youth workers work way past the number of hours you're supposed to work each week because they're just trying to add on stuff and make it work, thinking there's going to be an end in sight? When we do that, we're giving away our time. When we do that, we are giving away our money, because if you look at an hourly wage, how much are you investing? If you spend 10 hours working on a new idea, think about how much money you're spending on that. But when you fail fast, you fail cheap, what you're able to do is look at it, you know what, I didn't invest a lot in this, it's okay, I'm going to move on. Then you're able to beta test it. You go into the next level, it gets some traction, then you build it up, then you can invest in it, then you can launch. But you don't want to spend a lot of time doing something that's not going to work. And this is not just a program, right? What we're wanting to do is create an agile culture. We're wanting to create a way that we can let this kind of disruptive spirit be in who we are. So instead of creating a program that we think is going to last for the next 5 years, we create a program that we hope is going to last 6 weeks. At the end of the 6 weeks, we'll see what happens. And let's not call it a program. Let's call it an initiative or a movement. Something that helps people understand that this is not something that we're just going to keep going and keep going and keep going and keep on life support. Instead, we're going to let things go that aren't working. We're going to build up something that does work. And you know what? And you know this as youth workers, that next class of kids coming in, they're different than the ones that you have now. And they're used to having their needs taken care of and paid attention to. So they're not okay with the same old, same old. It could be a completely different thing you got to come up with for them to be able to engage them in true discipleship. And finally, if you haven't really looked into change management, I challenge you to do that. There's some great books out there, some great courses online. But the more you can understand about human behavior and change management, the more you're going to be able to navigate leading your context through this. And that's really what it's about, is how are we as youth workers going to be leaders to navigate this changing world of disruption. So that is disruption in a nutshell. And I'm glad to unshare my screen and would love to know what questions you have or comments you have, just kind of being taken through this thought process.
And guys, everybody is muted right now, so don't forget to unmute yourself if you want to speak up. And you're also welcome, if it's easier for you to chat the question, I would be happy to read it out or whatever.
Yeah.
But I know one of the questions that I have when I listen to this, so the idea of disruption and creating change, that resonates with me for a lot of reasons. But I'm curious about what's some advice for trying to do that in a culture that doesn't like disruption very much. Like you talked about earlier, to some extent, it is adverse to the institution to do that.
Absolutely.
So are there any tips or tricks, just briefly, that could cover that maybe you didn't talk about here?
That's a great question. I think it's worth tracing the disruption. That's a really great exercise that's not hard to do. Pick some different industries and put people in small groups and have them practice tracing all that disruption. Pick things like, retail, movies. Think about the Netflix streaming services compared to video rental in the 80s, right? Shoes, how you buy things. Just think about an industry, how people practice going through and their eyes open up. And then have them look at what the ministry of that church has done to change in the past 20, 30 years. And the disruption doesn't line up with the changes that have happened in the church program calendar. And a part of it is helping them frame this as an opportunity, not as a frustration. And that goes back to that change management of, how do we find scripture that helps us understand that God is with us in the midst of change. Just last Sunday that the story of Jesus cleansing the temple. Jesus comes along and throws a fit because he doesn't like what's happening in the temple. that's a powerful story of disruption, just coming in and flipping things around and yelling and screaming, doing what is right, doing what God wants us to do. And so taking people through that process, step at a time, to help them understand that that it is possible to catch up with this. Another big piece of it, in my experience, has been when you put a program to bed or end something, it's really important to acknowledge the grief. I even had a friend who would bring in symbols of death, like caskets or a pall or something that helped people grieve the loss of that program. They would encourage people to bring in pictures of that, that retreat that's happened for 40 years, pictures of their kids at that retreat, pictures of people that have gone before them, t-shirts from the events, whatever it is, and let them have space to grieve, knowing that God is with them in the grief. And then when the timing is right, to be able to offer hope in the midst of all that. And that's when the understanding change really is important, and how humans react differently to change. The kind of the high level on some change management theory is that when folks are given the opportunity to see what could happen and have a change agent or leader who's willing to take them there, as long as they're given space to be themselves and have some emotion along the way, they often want to get there. For me in congregations, the bottom line is the church members want to see their church family continue. That's different than the church building. That's different than the church staff or the church program. But you got to find out from them, what do they want to continue? Well, like, what's important to them? And then honor that in the plan to move forward. Tina, I love your statement to create space for youth to ask questions, encounter God, and learn to live as disciples of Christ. Allow, meet, and go. That's a great frame for what it means to be in ministry. So the question then becomes, well, how do we put that into action, right? And how do we get people to understand that that's what our focus is going to be, not having pizza tonight, right? The pizza is not the draw. Bowling is not the draw. The draw could be some food, because food's important for fellowship, because the fellowship helps create that space for asking questions. But if we're truly wanting to live as disciples of Jesus Christ, it's really easy to send the message that church is social, period. And that there's more to the story.
Well, we are coming to the end of our hour, and so unless there's any other questions, I just want to first of all thank Michael for this.
Absolutely.
This is great and informative, and I'm sure that Michael and certainly Piwa would welcome any kind of questions or further conversation you guys wanted to have about this specific thing or other things that Piwa is doing, because they're certainly disrupting things in their own world, and that's exciting.
Right.
Also, just kind of want to remind you guys, we will have somewhere up later tonight. We'll probably send it back out to the email list, the recording of this, but we'll also put it up on social and things like that. Probably later today, but it might be tomorrow, just depending on what hits me when I walk out the door today. Also, to remind you guys, we've got another one of these coming up on March 28th. That is going to be, the title is Teaming Up with Parents and Volunteers. That's with Matt Bond from the Youth Ministry Institute. So that should be a pretty interesting topic as well. And then a few others on in April. So thank you guys very much. Spread the word, please. And as always, if you guys have any questions about anything about the Knowledge Drop specifically, or in related to Montreat or youth conferences, please reach out and let us know. Thank you, guys. I hope you have a great day.
And feel free to go to pywa.org and sign up for our newsletter as well. You can keep this information, and we'll continue to be a good partner with Montreat.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.